Great. So this kind of open day session, primarily I'm going to focus on the part-time online MA, but there's an equivalent MA that's full-time and, at least under normal circumstances, is face-to-face, so in person. And the two courses are structurally, in a lot of ways, very similar. So probably as we go through, Paul and I've also both taught on the full-time MA. We'll probably note at certain points kind of differences between the two courses, but we're primarily going to focus, I think, on the part-time version of the course today. So the MA part-time online. What makes it a kind of unique course? I mean, I think obviously the most obvious thing is in the name, that it's an entirely online MA course. And, I mean, essentially you can do the entire course without ever setting foot, I think it's fair to say, Paul, in the UK or in London or in the college. So all of our kind of our teaching takes place online. All of our resources in terms of kind of resources for kind of specific units, our kind of library resources, and at the moment also our technical resources are all online. For a long time, that was a very kind of unique, novel, and kind of innovative thing. And I think we feel we still kind of actually lead the way in terms of this kind of fully online delivery, simply because we've been doing it for so long, as I'm sure Paul would attest, and I'm sure Paul could contribute to that. Because Paul, I don't know if he's probably too modest to say this, but set the course up in 2008, which I was trying to think of how long ago that was. 2008 was when Barack Obama was first elected. It was like quite a long time ago. And it's been running very successfully ever since then. But yeah, so the course has got it's got a very established kind of formula that's not something that we've just had to kind of create recently. It's something that's been really tried and tested. Um, it's the kind of cohort of students we have at any given time is completely global. This is a very quick attempt by me just to map where our current students are located. And you can see that across the 40 or so students that we currently have, and that's split across the 2 years, so each year group is roughly 20 students. We have students basically on every continent apart from Antarctica. That I think is also one of the quite unique things about the course, because it means whenever we all get together in a session, we're all bringing perspectives and experiences and examples from our home bases. And whenever we all go out to work on an assignment or a piece of coursework, people are coming back with very different responses to that assignment based on where they're located. So, when we give, for example, a very simple assignment like asking everyone to go out and take a portrait, you can imagine when you see this geographic spread that those portraits are enormously varied, in terms of what students choose to focus on. The course is flexible in the sense that we prioritize contact time, where we're actually working together and talking together like we are in this session. But it also is a flexible course in the sense that all of our core classes, our lectures and our workshops are also recorded, so that students who, whether because of work commitments or because of time zones or something else, can't attend live, are able then to listen back through this kind of archive that we built up. And so, so there's a lot of flexibility built into the course, because part of the people I think we've tended to recruit have often been people who are doing it part-time because they have jobs, for example, they have maybe family commitments or other things that make a full-time course kind of not really viable. That said, for anyone who doesn't have those commitments, again, the full-time MA may be more appealing. If you want to do an MA in a year, then I highly recommend checking out the full-time course as an alternative. So it's a part-time structure, as I mentioned. This is just a kind of not particularly glamorous look at how that works in practice. So I'll talk about the units in a minute, but the first year, essentially you do 2 units through the winter term. The winter break is then around the kind of Christmas time, and then through into the spring, those 2 units continue. You have the Easter break then, and then when you come back, you begin 2 further units. And again, I'll explain these units in a moment. Those continue over the long kind of 3-month summer break, and then finish up when you return in the kind of autumn term of year 2. You have the Easter break again. Sorry, that should be winter break. I've got those two wrong way around here. You have the winter break, and then you come back into the major project, which is the final kind of big unit, and that's what you're focused on for the final chunk of the course. So by contrast, the full-time course, all of this is compressed into just over a year. So it's a bit more of a kind of I suppose frenetic experience. I actually did the full-time course quite a long time ago as a student, so there's definitely a kind of different pace to the two of them, and those different paces suit different people. Some people like that kind of frenetic energy. Some people like more time perhaps to think and reflect and work gradually on things. It's a practical and rigorous course. I think online teaching has this kind of unfair reputation that you can't do things that are practical online. We've, again, through the amount of time we've been doing this, we've, I think, found a lot of ways to prove that wrong. And so the course is, it has a big emphasis on practical skills, has a big emphasis on rigor in the sense of, we want students to emerge from the course producing kind of, industry, kind of high quality industry standard work that's going to win awards and kind of turn heads and help to kind of define, I guess, what documentary photography and photojournalism are in 2020 and beyond. So, beyond sessions like this, where we're working maybe more with kind of presentations and stuff like that, we use things like webcams and kind of other setups to kind of do things like live demonstrations of things. So, like, this is a screen grab of a live demo of kind of stripping down a camera, for example. And we're partly obviously focused on teaching photographic skills, but we're also focused on teaching the whole range of skills that you need to survive and to thrive as a photographer. And that extends much beyond just being able to make great images. It extends to all kinds of other things, from knowing the kind of legal and kind of copyright framework around who can use your images and under what circumstances, through to, for example, maybe being, like a self-publisher who's able to kind of churn out books, or, someone who knows how to conduct a kind of more kind of investigative project, perhaps. So we try and cover this whole span, as well as obviously teaching photography. We try and cover this whole span of kind of practical professional skills as well. Good. I'm just seeing some of the questions coming in, and mostly we'll pick up on the questions as we get to the end of the slides, but I will also pick up on some as I go through. And the question Sash has just asked on practice versus theory, great question. I will respond to that actually now as I look at the structure quickly with you. So the course is comprised of 5 core units and then also a guest lecture program. The 5 core units are all assessed, so you're producing a piece of work you're going to be marked on, and that's going to contribute towards your end degree classification. And then the guest lecture program is obviously not an assessed part of the course; it's kind of extra. So we start you off. We take in people with a range of photographic skills. So some of the people we've had on the course are actually very established photographers. We've had quite a lot of photographers working, for example, for NGOs, who maybe want to kind of reinvigorate their practice or do something new with their work. We also bring in people sometimes who are retraining from another field, who have maybe less developed photography skills. And the first kind of unit, the first practical unit, which is photojournalism practice, is basically all about kind of leveling up those photography skills. So it's about putting you through your paces in terms of photography. So it's a series of quite rapid fire assignments where we're sending you out with briefs to produce images on a brief, then returning, and then we're spending time together going through the images, talking about what works and what doesn't work. And having been through this process myself, as someone who at the time was quite new to photography, it was it was completely eye-opening and really changed a lot of my work. In parallel to that, you're also doing a unit which is, if that's a kind of practical boot camp, this is more of a theoretical boot camp. So in parallel to the photojournalism practice unit, we're also then doing a history and theory unit, which is focused on the history and theory of documentary photography and photojournalism. So questions obviously like where did these fields come from and what are they about, but also very quickly getting into some very kind of deep ethical and moral and philosophical questions about what it means to do these things. And so it's a lot of analysis of kind of classic photojournalism documentary, quite a lot of reading of important influential texts, and quite a lot of discussion as groups about these things. So for the first two units, Sasha's question, the two theory and practice are quite parallel to each other but split. But then from there on, we actually kind of mix them together. So I'd say there's a high degree of theory in the sense that it is an MA, and so that obviously has an academic component to it. But I think beyond the first two units, we like theory and practice to basically be mixed together, to be mutually supporting, not to be things that are treated as kind of separate. So once you finish these two units, the history and theory essay unit, I'll just say, culminates in a 2,500 word essay. The photojournalism practice unit is assessed on a portfolio of work. Then you go into two further units, which again run in parallel. And the idea with these units is, having kind of established you and set you up with the fundamentals, these units are kind of designed to give you a bit more space for experimentation, to kind of hopefully discover a bit about yourself as photographers and kind of decide maybe what it is that you're really interested in. So the collaborative unit is the first of those units, and that is, as the name suggests, focused on the idea of collaboration, but we interpret collaboration in a very broad sense. So I mean, we're not restrictive about how you define collaboration. We've had some very creative and sometimes quite strange responses to that idea. And the other unit that runs at the same time as the collaborative unit is, the name is a bit of a mouthful. It's called the Documentary Practice of Research Methods unit, but we kind of colloquially call it the Rethink unit, because essentially the idea of the unit is to rethink what you've done to date as a photographer. So whatever you're already very comfortable with, we don't want you to do that. We want you to do something that you've never tried before. We want you to try and take your practice in a different direction. And the way both of these units are set up, they're set up with a lot of space to kind of reward experimentation, even when that experimentation doesn't necessarily work out. But I have to say, in most cases, the students who really push themselves and experiment, mostly produce brilliant work. And this, for example, is a project by a former student who's from Cyprus, and he was interested in illegal bird hunting in Cyprus. And so he started, he found these bird callers that basically hunters use to try and lure in birds. And he started creating his own versions, but using audio that was created from the code of photographs. And the idea was that the things he built were basically bird scarers. So they produced this incredible cacophony of noise, because the noise is generated from random code. And the idea was that they would kind of scare off birds rather than lure them in. So finally, then you move into the major project, which is the big kind of core. I mean, I guess it's really the core of the course. It's the point where we hope most students emerge afterwards with a piece of work they're really proud of, that they feel really kind of defines them as a photographer. And so, I mean, the scope of the major project is very open-ended, and we've had a huge range of projects over the years. Some have been very traditional and, kind of reportage influence. So, for example, this is a project by students a few years ago who focused on the last British tank regiment in Germany, who were on the verge of kind of pulling out. So he spent quite a lot of time. He was formerly in the army, so he used his kind of connections in the army and spent a lot of time with this unit, kind of documenting them as they prepared to leave. This is another project about climate change, and the student focused on Venice and she basically kind of discovered that Venice had this limited time before the city was basically predicted to be flooded by the rising seas. So she took more of a kind of conceptual approach, photographed the city, and then basically submerged her negatives into seawater from the Adriatic. And as the series goes on, the seawater basically starts to kind of destroy these images. She did it as a kind of photo book. It's very beautifully kind of produced, and actually then very quickly after she graduated was snapped up by a publisher. Again, a more kind of traditional kind of documentary project. Ashling's work was about a convent in Ireland, and she was interested in the kind of way it was, in effect, like it kind of served a lot of different roles, including in effect being a bit like a kind of a retirement or kind of care home for a lot of these elderly sisters, some of whom were, in their 70s and 80s. So it was again, she spent a lot of time there. She really kind of worked her way into this place and worked her way into the community and produced a really strong body of work, which again, I think is now, in fact, a book. Sometimes students respond to the history of photography with their major projects. So like Reese was interested in this place called Skinning Grove in the north of England that's been much photographed by a succession of very well-known photographers. But he was interested in the way that the residents hadn't really been involved in that process. So he decided to produce a body of work that was actually an outgrowth of his collaborative project. And it was about working with the locals to kind of pull apart the way they'd been depicted in the past and to kind of create a new piece of work about the place. And, people often think documentary and photojournalism are completely serious. They can also be, very funny. This was a project by Max, who basically used this kind of idea of a fictional protagonist, a fictional narrator. His project was supposedly made by this kind of paranoid photojournalist who he concocted. And this photojournalist was obsessed with plants in high security spaces. And the project became about the way plant life is kind of used in cities and offices and things like that to kind of basically to kind of hide and cover security infrastructure. So it used a very kind of funny strategy to explore a very kind of real issue. And so then, in parallel to all of that, throughout the year, once a week, we have a guest lecture that's just our course specific. So we're hearing from from photojournalists, documentary photographers, editors, curators, all kinds of people each week. And then there's also a departmental, that's for the whole of the photography department lecture, which is broader. It's in the sense that it's people from across the span of photography fields. So it might be fashion photographers, for example, it might be portrait photographers. That's currently online, and we think it's probably going to remain online whatever happens, like after the epidemic subsides, although that's a bit uncertain. But our core guest lecture program is always online. And these are just a few of the people we've had give it over the last kind of few months. And again, it's one of the nice things about being an online course is we're able to invite guests basically anywhere on the planet. So we're not limited by geography. We can invite anyone, anywhere, which is really nice. Okay, thanks, Paul, for fielding some of the questions. So I'm just going to briefly run through how we teach the course and a bit about the teachers, and then I think we'll be done and we can turn more specifically to your questions, which I can see coming in. So like I've already mentioned, the core of our teaching is face-to-face. Quite a lot of online courses prioritize this idea of kind of asynchronous learning, which is, for example, where you have resources available online at any time that you can go and look at. As I said, we designed the course, or Paul rather designed the course to be flexible, but we really prioritize having time together in these virtual classrooms. And so probably the majority of what we do together are tutorials where we're sitting in small groups, usually looking through work in progress, discussing it, comparing, talking about which images work or which don't, talking about different kind of strategies, different final kind of forms, and so on. So tutorials are a really big part of the way we teach the course. There are obviously also lectures. So typically, most units will alternate. 1 week we'll have a set of tutorials, the next week we'll have a lecture. So we have lectures again covering everything from more maybe kind of ethical questions like this one to sometimes talking about very practical things like how to kind of generate funding, for example, for projects, or how to approach publishers. And then we also have quite a lot of workshop activities, so for example, focused on using particular pieces of software, perhaps talking through, how to kind of develop a particular type of project and so on. So these are kind of like halfway, I guess you could say, between a tutorial and a lecture session. In terms of tutors, Paul, I don't know if you want to jump in and introduce yourself quickly.
Yes, hello, hi everybody. Yeah, I mean, as Lewis said, I mean, I kind of set the course up back in 2005 as a full-time course, and then the online course 2008. I've been teaching on both programs pretty much continuously all that time. Now I mostly do tutorials with you, mostly for the Rethink and then for the major project unit. And I do some teaching of classes, but my role is increasingly more research oriented and PhD supervision and so on. And I'll certainly be talking to, one of the things I do is help people, advise them on whether they want to go on and do PhDs afterwards. And indeed, we've had quite a few graduates from our course go on to do PhDs. So my track is now more research orientated, but I'm still pretty active on the course, and particularly as the course progresses towards the major project.
Brilliant, thanks, Paul. So Paul, and then I'm also kind of co-running the course at the moment. And I pretty much teach across every unit, I think, at the moment, but I particularly run the history and theory unit, and I'm also quite involved in the major project unit. And I guess my work, it's worth saying that we're all kind of, in one way or another, kind of practicing photographers in terms of the teaching staff. My work's quite focused on kind of long-term and slightly kind of investigative, research-focused projects. We also have Peter Fraser, who some of you may know his work. He's a very kind of established, well-known photographer from the kind of same generation as people like Martin Parr and Paul Graham. Amazingly experienced both as a photographer and as a teacher. In fact, I just discovered the other day chatting to him that he actually taught Wolfgang Tillmans, which I didn't know. So he particularly teaches on the Rethink unit because his practice is very, well, it's just the way he works suits that unit very well. But also he feeds into other units like the major project unit. Alongside him, we have Leonie Hampton, who, again, her photography is quite hard to characterize, really. But I mean, she's probably best known for this project called In the Shadow of Things that she did, which was kind of a collaboration with her family, and particularly with her mother, who was a hoarder. And the project was a kind of collaboration that kind of explored and aimed to kind of, to some extent, resolve her hoarding. So Leonie, again, is brilliant, another brilliant voice in the course, and I think particularly she's very good with students who may be making work that's about something quite close to home. Newer members of the team, Alethea, who's actually a former alumni of the course. She makes work that's very material in a way, and kind of about quite often intervening with negatives and images. But a lot of her work, she's from Australia originally, also engages with kind of histories of colonialism in Australia. So again, she and I currently co-teach the Rethink unit along with Peter, so she's very good for that. And for the collaborative unit, Becky Warnock is another of our tutors, and her entire practice, entire experience, I think it's fair to say, is really based around collaboration. She has run a whole host of kind of community projects and collaborative projects, including working for charities, quite well-known charities like Photo Voice and Photo Fusion. So we've got a really great staff besides all of the kind of guest and visiting lecturers who drop in from time to time. And lastly, careers. I mean, our students go on to do a whole host of things. Most of them, I think, are fairly obvious. I mean, a lot of them, I'm glad to say, end up as photographers. Quite a lot of them go on sometimes to work as editors, writers, curators, picture researchers, photography consultants. Some of them go on to work as teachers, and some go on, as Paul said, to study further, for example, PhDs. Quite often, as I've mentioned, our students are already actually involved in one of these areas, and they're looking to, to kind of, again, reinvigorate what they're doing. And so, I mean, for example, in recent years, we've had lecturers, photography lecturers from other universities. We've had picture editors and photographers working for big NGOs like, for example, the Red Cross. So, you know, I mean, we've got both a good pedigree in attracting people who are already well established in these areas, and also then sending people off into them afterwards. So I hope that's been useful. If you want to see more of our student work, we have a fairly new course Instagram account where our current students regularly take over and share current work in progress. So feel free to follow along to that if you'd like to see some more of their work. Again, if you're interested in knowing more about the full-time course, you can kind of compare and contrast, I guess, between the two course pages. You'll see that really they're very similar, apart from the part-time nature of our course and the kind of onlineness of our course. So yeah, and I think we can probably just jump over this. I mean, not much to say apart from London College of Communication. I mean, obviously it's hopefully fairly well known as a leader for kind of creative education, and it's part of this bigger university, University of the Arts London, which is comprised of these 6 colleges, of which we're one. And you know, together we cover, you know, we encompass a huge number of students from a lot of different backgrounds. So yeah, we're very well placed institution, I think, to kind of, you know, to expand your creative skills and expand your idea of what creativity is. So thanks for listening to me rattle on for half an hour. So I think that'd be a great moment just to kind of start picking up on questions. Will the part-time students be able to use the same facilities on campus as those in the full-time course? So part-time students have access to some facilities at LCC, but not the photography department one. So the part-time students have access to things like the library, the digital space, which is a kind of a space full of kind of computers and, you know, Macs and stuff like that. And the thinking behind that is basically because it's a global course, it doesn't really make sense if we have this kind of provision for some students that actually a lot of students aren't able to access. Sasha is asking about assessment and rethink. Yeah, so the rethink assessment is again a kind of a project. You know, it's a piece of work, and that could be a portfolio of images with accompanying text to explain them. But quite often students decide that their part of the rethink element is that they're going to make something they've never made before. So, for example, a student who's never maybe designed a book might decide to submit a book dummy, for example. Will the part-time course have the chance to collaborate with external organisations? Yeah, definitely. So with the collaborative unit, that's quite often a part of that unit. So in terms of the collaborations for that, we encourage students to kind of generate their own collaborations, you know, particularly in response to things they're already interested in making work about. But typically each year we'll also have a kind of internal project of some kind. So Paul, for example, is currently running one. I don't know if you want to say anything about the Climate Visuals project, Paul.
Yeah, so we do typically work with external partners. I'm working on a research grant at the moment with a group called Climate Visuals. So we've run that in part as part of the collaborative unit. So students on the course have got the ability to contribute to that research as co-researchers, which is great, obviously. And usually every year we try to run something like that. But also, you know, given that you're all spread out in different locations, you know, we are able to help you find and negotiate interactions with other external partners if that's what you want to do. So yeah, it's very mixed. So Jeff asked about submission, and then Eon was asking about the developed project. So with the application, obviously the personal statement is very important because that's telling us kind of why you want to do the course and where you're coming from. And it's good if you can demonstrate in that you've got some understanding of kind of contemporary photography that goes beyond Cartier-Bresson and Don McCullin, as it were, and kind of why you want to do the course. What are you passionate about? What are you looking to achieve by doing the course? In terms of portfolio, what we don't really want to see is a sort of random selection of really great images that don't really make any sense together. What we are looking for is some sort of coherent body of work, if you like, or a story or a project that expresses your ability to engage with something over a reasonably sustained period of time. You know, it's kind of some people submit one large body of work of maybe sort of 20 or 30 pictures. Some people might submit 2 or 3 smaller projects or work from other projects, as it were. So I think that's that's quite relevant, but basically we're looking for something that makes sense, that's kind of coherent, and that has some kind of narrative structure to it. In terms of the background of people on the course, I can see Sasha asking there, and also Alvin. We take a very broad range of students or participants on the course, and actually the majority don't have a first degree in photography. Most people have got a background in something else, and very often, as Lewis said earlier on, they're making career shifts, and we've certainly had a lot of people coming from finance and medicine and areas that you would not think initially have much to do with photography, but in fact they've often been extremely successful on the course. And if anything, actually, that's one of the great things that we really value on the course, is that it's a really interesting and diverse group of people with extraordinary backgrounds, and that makes it extremely rich. So, and we're also able, because the way the British education system works, to take people who don't have a first degree. We actually usually have several people a year who we admit on what's called APEL, which is assessed prior experiential learning, which basically means if you've got professional practice experience, it's the equivalent of a degree. Alvin, we have one scholarship at the moment that's specifically for the course, which is the 7 Foundation Scholarship. That is only for students who are not from a G20 country, though. So that is excluding the kind of wealthier countries, effectively. So if you're from a non-G20 country, then you are eligible to apply for that scholarship, and it's a full fees scholarship, so it would cover your tuition costs for the course. And just to Ion's question about developed project, it's not necessary to have a developed project. We do ask for a project proposal, but that's not in the expectation that's something you would actually do on the course. It's more just so that we can understand how you think and how you research and your approach to kind of conceiving stories. Some people do carry out one project throughout the entire course, but generally speaking, that is the exception. Because of the way the course works, and because of the way that we do make some quite significant interventions into your practice, as Lewis described, particularly with that Rethink unit, we do find that a lot of people quite radically change their ideas about what they do and what photography does and how photography works, and they end up in a very different place to where they began. So although it is possible, and people have certainly done one project in different iterations and different versions, sort of working through something throughout the entire course, very often, I would say the majority of students actually graduate with something that they didn't conceive of before they came on the course. Just to give you a bit more detail about the 7 scholarship, you have to have been accepted on the course first, and then there's a separate round of applications for the scholarship, and the deadline for that is in September, and we've only got 1 scholarship, so obviously it is quite competitive. No, sorry, Sam, the part-time course is only online. The online course, we think, has its own very unique experience that is absolutely on a par with the face-to-face course. There are differences, clearly. There are also great advantages to the online method. And the graduation, the grades that our students or participants get from both courses are virtually identical. And the strength of the work, I would argue, across both versions of the course is very, very strong. So I don't think there's any actual detriment at all to studying online, as Lewis said exactly. And when we do the installation for the exhibition, it's the same, we install it together. So there's no difference between the different projects. And we think, personally, Lewis and I think both very strong believers that in many ways the online course allows you to do things that you can't do with the full-time course. We're really surprised and very pleased every year with the level of community and the level of interaction, the peer-to-peer interaction, the bonding that occurs with the online course. And that persists after the course finishes. There's a really strong community of people that support each other and continue working together after they graduate, which is hugely important to us. And also, obviously, the really huge advantage of the online course is, first of all, obviously, it's very flexible. And secondly, you can participate in it wherever you are. So you can be in the field. We've had photographers, working for the UN in Sudan who've done their entire course from their porter cabin in the desert in the middle of a refugee camp. They've done their whole 2 years of study based out in Sudan. We've had another UN photographer based in Haiti. One of our very first graduates did pretty much the entire course from a shack on top of a mountain in America, where she was doing a project on mountaintop coal removal, and she had satellite broadband, and she did the entire course pretty much from. And yes, Sam, just to reiterate what Lewis said at the beginning, the basic structure of the two courses is the same. It's the same units. There are differences, obviously, because the flavour of the different courses and the different tutors that teach on them. But effectively, the structure of the two courses, the programs, the units, the unit credits, as it is at the moment, is the same. Yeah.
So Sasha's asking, can we briefly contrast MA photography? I mean, it's quite a difficult comparison to make. I'd say the main difference is that MA photography is it's a course that's focused on photography as fine art, and I think that kind of shapes a lot of what they teach, in the sense that, for example, I think their focus is very much on, for example, gallery or kind of museum display of photographs, and I think I think that interest in photography as fine art runs through a lot of what they do. That's obviously something that's part of our what we talk about, because documentary and photojournalism increasingly are in galleries and museums as much as they're in newspapers or magazines or on websites. But yeah, so I'd say that's the main difference. The unit structure is obviously different. They have units that cover different subjects. So I don't really have an intimate knowledge of that course because I don't teach on it. But so I suggest if you want to know more about it, you contact one of the teaching staff. Rebecca, study proposal, in terms of the project proposal, I'm guessing that is. I think if you're writing this proposal as part of the application, what generally is good is to talk obviously about what it is you want to photograph, to talk maybe a bit about why, why is this thing important, whether it's personally or kind of in a wider sense, why is it important that people know about this thing, to talk maybe a bit about the practicalities of it. So actually, are you going to photograph it in an unusual way, for example? Is it going to require any kind of particular skills or resources to make the work possible? So we're just looking for you to show both that you're thinking about what makes an interesting piece of documentary or photojournalistic work, but also that you're thinking about the practicalities and the realities of making a project. So I hope that answers that question a bit, Rebecca. In terms of the questions about deadline, I mean, we don't really, obviously the deadline, I guess you could say, is the start of term. Actually, this is also a reminder to pick up on something Paul answered earlier. Someone was asking about the number of students in the course, and as Paul said, it's typically 40, kind of 35 to 40 students. But just to be really clear about this, that's spread over 2 year groups. So each year group, in effect, is usually around 20 students. So the groups that you're typically in are smaller than that. It's not 40 students together all at the same time, except for a handful of things like the guest lectures. So we don't have like a date that's a cutoff. What we basically kind of have is a cutoff in terms of how many people we've recruited. So if we've recruited our 20, that's the deadline. So it's not really possible to give you a kind of date to say get it in by this point. I'd say if you're thinking about doing the course, get in an application as soon as you have the time to do it. So we tend to work in small groups, much more than one-to-one. We do have one-to-one sessions. I mean, particularly, for example, if a student's working on something that's very maybe kind of sensitive that they're not comfortable talking about in front of everyone else. But in general, we work in kind of small groups of, I'd say a typical tutorial is about 5 to 10 people. And part of the reason for that is actually we think that, basically we think that we're all peers, on the course as tutors and students, and actually we all learn from each other, and it's a lot more valuable to be together as a group talking about a person's work. The person actually gets more valuable feedback that way than just by sitting just with a tutor. Quite often the other students, as Paul said, they all come from very varied backgrounds and have a lot of combined experience. Sometimes other students bring really valuable insights into the work that someone's trying to do. Lauren, how many on the full-time in-person course? I think it's around kind of 30 to 35 typically in a year group, but I think it ebbs and flows a bit, so that's pretty rough. you still discuss film photography alternative processes? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like I mentioned, Alethia's work is very much rooted in materiality, in kind of working and reworking analog photography. So, I mean, we talk about film and alternative processes a lot, both from a technical perspective, but also from a kind of, I guess a more philosophical perspective of what can you do with these processes. I didn't really explain it, but the image I used to illustrate my slide about me is actually is a cyanotype from a project I'm doing at the moment that uses the cyanotype process. So again, we're all practicing photographers. We all have quite different practices, but we're all making images, and we all have an understanding of how photography works, both in a digital sense and in a kind of older-fashioned analog sense. Sasha, you mentioned PhD program, and some students have progressed. I didn't see anything on the website. I mean, the thing that we don't mention anything about PhD progression on the website because it's kind of a separate process, I guess. I mean, it's not that we're funneling students out of the MA and into PhDs, but we have a very close kind of relationship, I guess you could say, with the kind of research department. And so, so I mean, we students who want to go on to do PhDs, we're very well positioned to kind of guide them into that process. And as Paul says, he currently supervises several students, including I think one who is a former graduate of our course. So yeah, I hope that answers your question there, Sasha. This might be a more general university question rather than a course, but how does disability factor in? I'm autistic and it could impact how I approach work, learn, etc. Yeah, absolutely. We have a really good kind of learning department of kind of specialists in the department in the library, who provide a lot of kind of additional support to all students that's kind of tailored, I guess, to their specific needs. So that includes language support, for example, for students whose first language isn't English. It includes students who have disabilities. And we've had some really great kind of success stories with students with a range of kind of different profiles on the course. A few years ago, we had a student who is profoundly deaf, who did the course with us for 2 years, produced some really great work and graduated. So I think, we've got quite a good track record on that. And obviously, it's always a question of individual needs and having a conversation about what each person needs. But yeah, there is absolutely help for that. Lightroom, Photoshop. Yeah, we do go through. We do some practical sessions around that. I mean, there's an expectation that there's quite a lot of independent learning as well. So I mean, we're not going to run through everything in Lightroom or everything in Photoshop, but we do some sessions that are basically kind of about making sure you're all kind of okay with the fundamentals of those kind of platforms because they're pretty key. And we use them a lot, in terms of things like workshops, for example. If I recently did a workshop with students on book design, and basically what I'll be doing during that is screen sharing, InDesign, for example, and we'll be talking through how you do things step by step. So. Sasha, as a novice to the arts, how does this program stack up reputationally? I expect some positive views. I mean, that sounds like a bit of an invitation to toot our horn. I think we've got a very good reputation. I think the MA is very well known in photography, at least. And I think UAL is very well known in the arts and creative industries more broadly. I don't want to kind of go any further than that for reasons of modesty, but I think we have a pretty good reputation. Sasha, in terms of applications, Paul is currently handling most of the applications, so actually I'm afraid he'd probably be better positioned to answer that, but I think probably within a week or two. I think he's fairly quick about it. Sasha, I believe the portfolio is submitted as part of your application. Yeah. So David, I'm thinking about applying next year. I don't have an undergraduate degree, but have professional experience in the developed practice. Yeah, that's absolutely fine. I mean, as Paul said, one of the nice things is that we're able to be very flexible about prior experience. And, we've had people in the past who've done the course who didn't have, undergraduate degrees. In some cases, really left school at 16, for example, but who had, a lot of professional experience. And, we're generally very happy to take those people because, we think professional experience counts for a lot, basically. So yeah, that's not an issue. Okay, so I think we'll probably finish up there. So thanks again. Great to see so many people here for this. It's been really nice kind of seeing you also logging in from all over the world. And I hope that's answered your questions and I hope that's been useful. Great. Okay, well, thanks again, everyone. Have a lovely afternoon and evening. And yeah, I hope to maybe see some of you in the autumn. Take care.